Hey, Gabe.
Hey, what's up, Tim?
I have a New Year's resolution here at the start of 2020 to finally watch movies other than ones with nuclear weapons in them. I even bought myself one of those unlimited movie pass things.
But Tim, don't you have a baby coming in March?
Wait, you're right. That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now.
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear nonproliferation for a living. I'm joined today on the podcast by my co-host, Gabe. Gabe, welcome back.
Hey, how's it going, Tim?
Pretty good. What's your qualifications to be on this podcast? Are you a noob expert guy or just
Well, I met you some years ago, and you made me watch some movies, and you were starting to talk to me about nuclear weapons, so that's the qualification.
And that didn't turn you away. That's terrific.
It did not.
But fortunately, we're also joined in the podcast studio / my living room by another one of our close friends, Elliot. Elliot, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Tim. Good to be here. I think last time when I was here, it was episode 27, doing the Atomic Train with Rob Lowe. 2-part, 4-hour miniseries that was pretty excruciating to get through. So thank you for giving us 2 shorter things to watch that are much more entertaining and I think interesting to talk about.
Well, when that was over, I did promise you to watch some good nuclear content at some point. It only took 1 full year, but welcome back in the podcast zone.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Speaking of time and also zones, we're going to talk about 2 episodes of the Twilight Zone that are about time and nuclear weapons. We'll first talk about Time Enough at Last, which is Season 1, Episode 8, that was originally aired on November 20th, 1959. And then we'll also talk about No Time Like the Past, Season 4, Episode 10, from originally airing on March 7th, 1963. I always forget how old the Twilight Zone original series is. Were you guys fans of the Twilight Zone before being asked to watch these episodes for the podcast episode?
I was a huge fan. I think I got into it at 1 year because it was a New Year's Day Sci-Fi Channel marathon. And so we pretty much watched, this was in my 20s when you had time to do this, and pretty much watched basically probably every episode of Twilight Zone, through.
That's pretty impressive that you finished a marathon.
Yeah, I finished a marathon, no big deal.
Yeah.
I don't like to brag about it usually.
Nice. Gabe, what about you?
Yeah, no, I've always liked the idea of the Twilight Zone, just being, somewhat of a fan of science fiction and things like that, and just old stuff in general. I just never had a chance to sit down and actually watch it, so I'm glad this was the first time I got to see it, so a good opportunity.
I'm glad we can be the excuse for that. We also covered a previous Twilight Zone episode on episode 14 of our podcast. Twilight Zone episode was called The Shelter. It's a great one. It's one of the episodes of the Joel era of the podcast. Both of you guys went to school with Joel, so that's kind of a fun connection here. He was original co-host of this podcast. But that episode involves a guy during the Cold War builds himself a fallout shelter. During his birthday party, all of his neighbors make fun of the fact that he's a wacko, paranoid guy who builds a fallout shelter. Then the radio says there's an incoming bomber strike, and he goes in his fallout shelter, and the neighbors try to break in. And there's a big fun twist at the end. It's a great episode. So for this one we're talking about today, I think there's 2 main underlying questions that I want to cover. One, what was the contemporary moment in history like when these episodes were released, in terms of the Cold War, nuclear tensions? And also, what do these episodes tell us about how to manage the danger of nuclear war? And then, of course, as relatedly is how does the Twilight Zone treat these topics? Because Rod Serling, who was the showrunner, who wrote a lot of these episodes, this was something that was always really close on his mind because, obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, all of these things were there for everybody. But for him in particular, he wanted to cover social issues, and that included nuclear weapons. So we'll summarize each episode. We'll talk about the nuke themes present in each one, and then wrap up with some general discussions, some ratings, and recommendations as per usual. So, Gabe, which one are we going to start out with first?
Let's start with Time Enough at Last. How about that? That was the first one serially that was produced from Season 1, Episode 8, November 20th, 1959.
Yeah, so this was one of the most popular episodes of The Twilight Zone. People, if they've heard about The Twilight Zone, they probably have heard about this episode. Stars Burgess Meredith, who people may know as Mickey, the trainer in the Rocky Balboa movies, but he was also the Penguin in those fun 1960s Adam West era Batman TV show. This was adapted from a short story written by Lynn Venable in 1953 in a science fiction magazine called If: Worlds of Science Fiction. It's pretty short. I'll link to it in the podcast show notes because it's what is that? The Gutenberg Project. It's like a website that has a bunch of old, out of copyright print of stuff, and you can read it. And it's pretty great. You can read the whole thing in like about 5 minutes or something. Elliot, why don't you do what normally starts a Twilight Zone episode? There's like usually some sort of cold open, and then Rod Serling pops in out of nowhere and gives us an opening narration. You do not have to do a Rod Serling impression, but if you do, you get bonus points.
Okay, we'll do a 50-50. Witness one Mr. Henry Bemis, a charter member in the Fraternity of Dreamers, a bookish little man whose passion is the printed page, but who is conspired against by a bank president and a wife and a world full of tongue cluckers and the unrelenting hands of a clock. But in just a moment, Mr. Bemis will enter a world without bank presidents, or wives, or clocks, or anything else. He'll have a world all to himself, without anyone.
That's probably the thing that scared people the most in 1959 was a world without bank presidents and wives? That's insane.
I feel one of those is maybe more important than the other.
Yeah.
We should cover that. Just if anybody's listening, if my wife's listening, put that disclosure right out front.
Perfect. So it's pretty clear from even just this and this very start of the episode. Henry, he's an inefficient bank teller with eyes that are so bad that he needs these thick Coke bottle lens glasses really to see anything in front of his face.
Do you think that's foreshadowing at all?
It's something to look out for
possible?
In the future. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He just wants to read books, right? He doesn't want to be bothered by customers, bosses, or wives, which, to be honest, as someone who works in an office environment, it's not an unreasonable request that the bank president asks his employees to not read fiction while trying to deal with the customers and count the money. But, the boss is pretty mean about it when he calls him out.
Right.
I see you constantly going downstairs into the vault during your lunch hour. Ultimatum, Mr. Bemis. You will henceforth devote your time to your job and forget reading, or you'll find yourself outdoors on a park bench reading from morning till night for want of having a job. Good day, Bemis.
I know people like this who are just, they're dreamers. They can't get down to the job, but they're smart people and they just love to read. So, he's there reading at work, and when he goes home, he wants to live in the world of Fahrenheit 451.
In the sense that every time he has a book, he has to hide it from his wife who wants to burn it.
Right.
Exactly.
Which I kind of struggled with the wife's motivations and why does she care so much? And they had one part where they were kind of explaining it I want you to be a conversationalist and whatever, and then there was another moment where it was basically I'm just spiteful because I don't like you as my husband, and you like this, so I just basically don't want you to have this thing.
And this is before no-fault divorce, so...
Right.
He's stuck. They're stuck, yeah.
I guess they're stuck. I was thinking about it. I was like, okay, what's the modern equivalent? I feel like this is kind of like people who have a smartphone addiction and just never put their phone down at family dinner,
Oh, I definitely want to see this episode remade with someone who just won't get off their phone.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. Fortunately, when he's at work, he can take his lunch break in the bank vault. Because he's got the code, and he's able to go into the bank vault and close the door and read all the fiction and newspapers and other things he wants to read in very peace and quiet. So he opens up a newspaper, right? He's sitting there, he's eating a sandwich, and there's a big headline that pops up. H-bomb, capable of total destruction. It says, here's the text on here. It says, noted atomic scientist reveals possibility of H-bomb. One of the world's leading nuclear physicists today stressed the danger to mankind in a race in the hydrogen bomb as total and catastrophic in a speech given at a symposium on nuclear weapons before 35 top scientists of the United States and Great Britain. And if you were reading the short story that we'd mentioned earlier this is based off of, I think there's an article in a magazine called The New Weapons and What They'll Do to You. It's quite a thing. Does it seem like, though, that H-bombs have not been invented yet? Or is it like, hey, they're here, what do you need to do about it?
How do you think a viewer from 1959, when they saw this flash on the screen, do you think it would click to them and they'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, H-bombs are dangerous? Or would they be like, oh, I've only heard a little bit about this? Would they be aware of what this is?
I think they would, because this really is the timing of it is pretty close to when these things first came out. So November 1952, what test that was codenamed Ivy Mike, it was the Ivy series, and Mike was the shot of that series, was the first of a thermonuclear device. And the short story itself came out in 1953. So you can imagine pretty closely written right after that. These weapons were pretty new, I would say, and people, really did not know what they could do to you, because the only time that they were used was, to destroy two relatively small Japanese cities. And when they saw pictures coming home from, the destruction, it was bad, but, the cities weren't completely wiped out. Some people survived. There were some buildings, there's this famous domed building that was right at the epicenter of where the explosion took place. And this bomb was exploded, in the air. It wasn't like on the ground. It was there and it survived. So people thought, oh, atomic bombs are going to be bad, but they're not going to destroy everything. But H-bombs, as we'll talk about in a second here, are categorically different in terms of both destruction and radiation damage. And then in 1955, the Russians did their first test. The RDS-37 was their first test, and that one had a nominal yield of up to 3 megatons. But it was scaled down to 1 megaton for the test. And
so how would you compare that? Like, how many times more powerful is that than, let's say, like the Hiroshima Nagasaki?
A megaton is 1,000,000 tons. The bombs that were dropped were between 13 to 21 kilotons, 1,000 tons. So we're talking about the difference between, say, 13,000 tons and 1 million.
That's a lot of tons.
It's the difference between a bomb that can destroy a city center versus one that can level like Manhattan.
Yeah,
right.
Essentially,
but leave the sporting good cabinets in place.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay.
So hydrogen bombs, what they are, right? They're different than regular atomic bombs, the first ones that were created, because what they do is they actually use the intense heat and thermal radiation from the first stage of a fission bomb. When fission bomb is when you split atoms apart. So usually it's uranium or plutonium. These are the ones that were used against Japan. Those are, uranium and plutonium are some of the heaviest and least stable elements. So if you hit them with a neutron, they're more likely than other elements to break apart. What a hydrogen bomb does is it uses hydrogen, which is the lightest element on the periodic table, and instead of splitting them apart, it uses that intense heat through somewhat still classified, but if you read the literature, you can figure it out how they end up doing it. It fuses those hydrogen elements together, which produces a lot of neutrons,
right.
And then those neutrons will start fission in other places. So the big thing about a bomb is you want it to be as efficient as possible within a fraction of a millisecond before the entire thing just breaks apart and destroys itself. You want to get as much fission reaction as you can with the elements you get, because we're talking like if you have a pound of uranium and you have it in an atomic bomb, the early ones would only make something like 15% efficiency in terms of the amount of material that would be fizzled, and everything else just destroyed. A thermonuclear bomb can jump that up into higher percentages, and that's why you get larger yields, in the end. People knew about these ideas during the Manhattan Project. People were advocating the potential for it. They even they gave it a name. Like the original atomic bombs were called the Gadget. That was the code name as they were working on it. And the hydrogen bomb was called the Super. So you can see even the people back then, they thought that that's how they would do it. And that's why you get hydrogen bombs can be done upwards of, at the lowest level, 50 kilotons, which is way higher than the bombs dropped over Japan, but they can be upwards of even 50 to 100 megatons. I mean, the Tsar Bomba that people talk a lot about, the largest Russian test, could have potentially been 100 megatons, but they scaled it down for just practical reasons to 50. Even then, that's pretty crazy.
All right, so shall we go back to the story?
Now that we officially scared everyone and described how people would be scared at the time, Henry's like, okay, this is not great, but it doesn't concern me, right? He read something, but he didn't process it, right?
And right on cue, there's a blast. You see his watch glass cracks, which I guess implies.
I have no idea what that is.
Was that supposed to be the shock wave, the
but
pressure
he's in a
wave?
bank vault.
Oh yeah, that's true. But there's still oxygen in there, right? It's somehow exposed to the outside.
I don't think the door was closed all the way.
Okay.
Probably not a good idea to just hang out in a bank vault where the door is closed, right?
You probably run out of air at some point. I don't know if those are ventilated.
The watch glass breaks, and then there's a lot of camera shaking, and he's like, there's a lot of noise, and it implies that a nuclear bomb has gone out.
It's the kind of shaking in a Star Trek episode.
Exactly.
To speak your language, where
it's
just the camera moving up and down, and the characters are flopping about.
And I mean, like, often happens in the Twilight Zone, it's sort of hitting you over the head with it, I feel like, with the clock stopping, and there's such this, like, strong connection in popular culture between, like, time and clocks and nuclear weapons, and so it's like, okay, yes, you've run out of time now. Yeah. The bomb has gone off, and the clock has stopped. That
imagery is pretty strong in Watchmen, the original series. I haven't seen the HBO one yet, but I know the original comic book series, it's clock imagery is a big one, and then the clock it stops, and then there's also a famous clock, like a pocket watch that was in Hiroshima that stopped right as the bomb, exploded. So I think a lot of that is being drawn from real life history, and it just happens to be the imagery that we're going to see with Henry and the bank vault. What happened? So Henry, he wakes up. Fortunately, he finds his glasses and puts them back on his head. He gets out of the bank vault, and everyone he knows is pretty much gone. There's no one else left. The city is more or less in ruins, except for, like, as Elliot mentioned, some key places like the gun vault at a sporting goods store and a couple other places that we'll talk about at the end. But the town it's completely gone. Like, it seems like things are burned. There's no fire, but, like, it's done now.
There's a lot of smoke, though, right? I feel like there's kind of smoky ash in the background. The bridges are collapsed in the background. He goes to his apartment to try to find his wife. It's collapsed. It's gone. There are strangely no bodies.
None. You see a hand, but it's covered by rubble.
Yeah, which I took to be sort of broadcast standards in 1959.
Probably.
Maybe.
I mean, they're pushing it enough to show a nuclear explosion in that time period. There were movies that had nuclear explosions, but it was very rare to see it on TV.
Well, but I guess a lot on the show, you talk a lot about the depiction of the aftermath. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'd be curious to hear from you, given the budget constraints and the constraints of the time, how do you think it did in terms of portraying post-nuclear wasteland?
I think they don't show enough fire damage, but it looked like the pictures you would see of Hiroshima. Okay. Lots of buildings knocked over, especially the shots that are probably more of an effect shot where you see the pan across where they didn't necessarily build that. I mean, it looked bad. It definitely doesn't show buildings just standing until a little bit later in the episode. I thought they did a pretty good job with it. And what really nails it for me is the very rare in a Twilight Zone episode. I think there's only about 3 or 4 of these, but there's a mid-episode narration by Rod Serling. And I'll read this one because I think this one really, if not visually nailing it, what they talk about does a great job of showing that. Seconds, minutes, hours. They crawl by on hands and knees for Mr. Henry Bemis, who looks for a spark in the ashes of a dead world. A telephone connected to nothingness. A neighborhood bar. A movie. A baseball diamond. A hardware store. The mailbox that was once his house and now is rubble. They lie at his feet as battered monuments to what was but is no more. Mr. Henry Bemis on an 8-hour tour of a graveyard. I think that's pretty good.
He's very shocked by it. He says, they're all dead. They must be. Everyone is dead except for me. And he calls out for his wife, who I thought he'd be happy that the wife was dead at least, but apparently not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he wants to read. He doesn't like that she doesn't want him to read, but there's something there.
You got it. I mean, I feel that we would not sympathize with the character if his wife, was obliterated, and he was
He started skipping.
I think he forgets. We'll get to it. I think he forgets about her later on. But anyway.
Well, the passage of time heals all wounds.
I wouldn't read too much into that.
There's of course, the obvious allusion here. Mr. Henry Bemis on an 8-hour tour is the allusion to Gilligan's Island, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, because
he's the last man alive,
and it's going to last longer than 8 hours, as definitely happens.
Right.
So he was obviously saved by the bank vault. He talks about how he's actually not all that happy, and sure, if he actually does want to live, given the fact that all he has left is he has plenty of food. Right. He talks about all this canned food. He's got lots of cigarettes. He can survive for as long as he wants, but he doesn't know if it's worth it to be this lonely and have nothing to do. It reminded me of a famous quote that President Kennedy gave in front of the UN in 1961. So I'll read a quick version of this. A war today or tomorrow, if it led to nuclear war, would not be like any war in history. A full-scale nuclear exchange lasting less than 60 minutes with the weapons now in existence, which I think is a good reference to the hydrogen bomb given the context here, could wipe out more than 300 million Americans, Europeans, and Russians, as well as untold numbers elsewhere. And the survivors, as Chairman Khrushchev warned the communist Chinese, the survivors would envy the dead, for they would inherit a world so devastated by explosions and poison and fire that today we cannot even conceive of its horrors. And, of course we have the weapons, they're still here today, so the speech didn't solve that problem, but one of the things that he negotiated, that Lyndon Johnson was able to sign into law and negotiate into force later, was the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which committed countries who have nuclear weapons to eventually get rid of them, and countries that didn't have them agreed never to build them. And that's kind of the bedrock foundation of the non-proliferation regime that we all, in my field, we work on today. We haven't done a great job, but, obviously there's fewer numbers and things like that.
Yeah.
But I don't know, that sentiment that Henry describes is pretty well represented by that Kennedy quote from a couple years later. I don't think he's channeling Henry Bemis, but it's the same idea.
Yeah.
Henry always wanted solitude, but did he really want it at this particular cost? But anyways, he puts his suit on, as every good Twilight Zone episode has people look great in their suits.
Yeah, I mean, it was 1959, that's what you're supposed to wear.
How long would you gentlemen, after the bomb drops, stop wearing suits?
Yeah.
I would... The first day, if I was wearing a suit, I'm like, this is now wrapped around my waist.
Exactly.
I'm not wearing this. I'm rolling my sleeves up. I'm turning
Maybe
these
even loosen
pants
up the
into
tie a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I'm turning these pants into shorts, like, almost immediately.
What's so interesting, I mean, there's this, all his, material needs are taken care of. I mean, still has nice clothes. He finds food stock, and you see him saying to himself, I have plenty of food. I could eat forever. And he's able to sleep on a couch. His material comforts are taken care of, but he's with all the people gone, within an hour or so, he gets struck by this crushing loneliness. And I thought that was a very interesting commentary on the need that we have for society, that it is this very nourishing, humans are social animals, and yeah, you could just keep us alive and feed us and all that, but pretty quickly, you take away people, and people start to unravel a bit.
Even for a person who didn't really care all that much about people not too long ago.
Exactly.
Why don't you describe what he ends up finding in the rubble when he's tries to start a car, it doesn't work, and he gets pretty depressed, but he finds something fancy in the rubble.
It's interesting what has survived in this world and what hasn't. So he finds his way to a sporting goods store, and there's a glass case that tips over, and out falls a revolver. And so he picks up the revolver, and he's got kind of a monologue about, I'll just end it all, because how long can I do this alone, basically, to your point about his isolation, and he only has, I think importantly, he I think specifically says, I've read that newspaper through 3,000 times or whatever, and how many more times can I read the newspaper? I'm super bored as well, I think, at this point.
But fortunately, he sees something off in the distance, a building that wasn't completely destroyed, the public library.
Yep. Yay.
Despite all of the fires,
books all over the stairs.
Yeah, so
that survived.
He builds all these books. He kind of piles them up. He kind of swims around in them like Scrooge McDuck would in his own bank vault. Connecting all this stuff together with his coins and everything. He sees all these books. He gets really excited. Right, he's going to start to read his first book.
Books! Books! All the books I'll need. All the books I'll ever want. Shelley, Shakespeare, Shaw. There's time enough at last.
Because now he has all this time, and his glasses slip off his head. They shatter on the ground. Just when there was time enough at last, Henry says, "That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now. There was all the time I ever needed." And, they're not a sponsor of the podcast, but it sounds like Henry should maybe think about a free trial of Audible audiobooks or something else.
So there's this closing narration at the end where Rod Sterling comes back one last time. Yeah, he says, "The best laid plans of mice and men, and Henry Bemis, the small man in the glasses who wanted nothing but time. Henry Bemis,
now just a part of a smashed landscape. Just a piece of the rubble. Just a fragment of what man has deeded to himself. Mr. Henry Bemis in the Twilight Zone."
No. Yeah. So what do you guys think of that twist?
I actually, so what I read into this, I think, and maybe it's too much, I think he's making a commentary on just how fragile all the stuff that we've learned over thousands of years of being human, right? We had this compendium of everything we've learned. We've written it down. We've taught it to the later generations. And for me, at least, him coming across all this knowledge, everything, and it's all before him, and it only took those glasses to kind of fall apart. I think there's some commentary being made here about, with nuclear weapons, how easily we can just destroy all of that and throw all that away, really, and then have to start from scratch if we even get to survive.
Yeah, I think that is definitely in there. I keep always talking about the movie Threads, but that is definitely the premise of it. It's called that because nuclear weapons don't just destroy buildings and people; they literally destroy the threads that hold civilization together. That ends on about 15 years after the bombs go off, and you see people devolve down to watching old videos of like cat skeletons,
right.
And people don't even know what a cat is, and they're just watching this, and their communication is broken down. No one's got glasses, no one's reading. Even if they had all the books in the world, they would burn them for food and fire and stuff.
Yeah.
I wanted to read you the ending of the short story, if you wouldn't mind. I love the way that this is done, but I want to know what you guys think as opposed to how it's portrayed in the show. I think they're both good in their own right, but I want to hear your guys' thoughts to this. There was the rumbling of complaining stone, minute in comparison, which the epic complaints following the fall of the bomb. This one occurred under one corner of the shelf upon which Henry sat. The shelf moved, threw him off balance. The glasses slipped from his nose and fell with a tinkle. He bent down, clawing blindly, and found, finally, their smashed remains. A minor, indirect destruction stemming from the sudden, wholesale smashing of a city, but the only one that greatly interested Henry Bemis. He sat down at the blurred page before him. He began to cry. I really like that. Especially that language of, yeah, the bomb went off and it destroyed everything, but the only thing
that and I think it goes back to does he really not care the fact that humanity was split up, it's kind of a weird. My first reaction was to say, okay, the moral of this is like careful what you wish for, but actually he doesn't seem at points to be that concerned with the fact that the world just got blown up. As long as he's going to have his glasses and be able to read the book, then it's like, okay, well, cool, that's maybe better than my life before.
In a world where he had those glasses that have the little ties around them, around his neck, you could see him being pretty content for maybe for decades later with his eating some spam and reading Shakespeare.
Right.
Seemed like he'd be fine for quite a while.
Which I do think it's like this. Whoever wrote the short story, I guess, really did not like novels or something, because it's like
they're too long.
They just
too long.
Yeah. It's the wife. We turn out it's the wife character who wrote the short story.
So in terms of the nuke stuff in here, first question I had for you all was: did you want more build up to the nuclear explosion or war, or was that simply enough for you in the story? Because in the short story, there's like a magazine article that he's reading. The bomb explodes within the first two paragraphs. It's like one of the first things that happens. But then there's like a previously on flashback type thing, and there's build up. They talk about, well, there's a collapse of conference is imminent. Salon predicts war only days away. But I think the interesting thing is Henry reads these things, but he never has enough time to read anything more than just the headlines. So he just scans headlines and reads and reads and reads. Yeah. And I wonder if that could be commentary for our news consumption culture. Would you have wanted more build-up, or you think that was sufficient?
Yeah, I mean, I think as it was, for me, it basically, since it did kind of get to it so quickly, it kind of felt like that's just the plot device, the fact that it's a nuke. Like, it could have been an asteroid or a plague, or just everybody disappeared, a la Langoliers, or whatever, right? Like, you could have basically had any sort of disaster and that killed everybody on Earth, and it would have worked just fine. It seemed slightly incidental that it was a nuclear thing. And so to me, because they dealt with it in that relatively sort of like quick fashion and not exploring it too deeply, it didn't feel core to the ultimate sort of like lesson we were supposed to take from it.
Okay. Gabe, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree totally. I think what's more interesting about this one is what happens afterwards.
Well, it is. I haven't thought about it like that. I think I still see some thematic thrust behind the idea of like, well, mankind destroyed itself and that, but I think it's a good point, because the way they treat the detonation and the collapse of the city is as if it was just a meteor, or something that hit. Because things that they don't really care all that much about is, there's no discussion about radiation.
Mm-hmm.
Having all the food in the world is no good if you are suffering from radiation sickness and can't keep it down.
Yeah. Also, would the food be okay? That was one of my questions.
It depends. They've done lots and lots of tests back in the day about, putting canned food relatively, different distances from an atomic bomb. There is a certain point where it tends to be fine. Depends on where it was. If it was directly outside and exposed to the blast, then that's not as good as if it was, say, in a storage vault or in a cabinet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bigger concern that you would have is that when there's fallout that happens, the fallout particles that become, essentially it's dust and concrete and people and everything that gets mixed with radioactive particles, and that's what fallout is. And it when it drops down, even a speck of dust that falls down is emitting gamma radiation, alpha, beta particles. That stuff, if that gets to your food, that's really the thing to be really concerned about. Canned food, because it's closed, tends to be okay.
So you have to be really sure when you're opening that lid to not let it slide
Wash
into the top of the food. Wash it off first, yeah.
Yeah, you wash it off, clean it. One of the first things you can do if a nuclear bomb happens and you are exposed to fallout is to clean your clothes. So wherever you're going to hole up, don't have the same clothes on that you had when you went previously. Or wash your hands, wash everything off, so that there's you're not sitting there with some dust particles on you that are continuing to hurt you and then everyone that's around you.
I guess if everyone disappears, you probably don't need clothes, though. You could just...
Fair enough.
Yeah.
That's a different Twilight Zone episode. That's the remake. But, one other thing, too, is I'm glad that Henry was in the basement, because one of the things we learn that how nuclear weapons, can hurt you is they can cause you to go either temporarily or permanently blind, depending on how close you are and where you're looking at the actual initial detonation and the initial flash that ends up happening. So one megaton detonation, which we're talking about hydrogen bombs, we can get up that high, can cause you to go blind temporarily up to 13 miles away during the day. And if it's at night, it's even worse. If you're 53 miles away from a nuclear detonation and you're looking at it, it's 1 megatons at night, you can be temporarily blinded for, we're talking temporary, it's like hours.
Yeah.
And you imagine while that's happening, there's also fires and chaos and you can't see anything.
I think, not to bring this back to airplanes, which I like to talk about a lot,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
didn't the pilots used to have an eye patch that they would kind of cover one eye and they'd go blind in one eye and then just
Pirates or pilots?
Both, really. Pirates of the sky.
Yeah.
No, the pilots who flew the nuclear bombing missions. Right?
Oh, yeah. That's I don't think I've heard that story, but that sounds right.
Yeah, I think they had an eye patch on one eye, and if the bomb went off, it would blind the other eye, and they just moved the eye patch over, and voila, there's a good eye.
Apparently, that's why pirates of the seas do it, is that they have an eye patch that when they're under the deck, and then they come back outside, they switch the eyes so that their eyes can adjust.
I think it's the opposite. It's when they're outside.
They go down.
Yeah, they want to have one that's adjusted to darkness.
There we go.
So, yeah.
So it's pretty bad. If you're close enough, you can even have permanent retinal damage and burns to your eyes, which is one of the most common injuries reported in Japan after the U.S. had dropped the atomic bombs. In addition, other than obviously like burns and those things, was blindness for individuals.
Which obviously would have been great to work into the themes of this episode. So I missed opportunity there.
Yeah, it would have been nice if he was temporarily blinded and then. Oh, that just could have been the story.
Could have just been it. Yeah, another bomb goes off or something.
Oh yeah. There's no discussion about firestorms. Firestorms are pretty bad. When you have that many, a nuclear explosion can cause not only a ton of incredible fire damage by itself with the fireball, but because of the heat that then rises up with the mushroom cloud, it pulls all of the air in and creates essentially like a vortex of fire. Mm-hmm. It can cause gas pipes to burst all around a city. And those can start a bunch of fires together and then all kind of go together. No discussions about that. Obviously, the books in the show are just kind of scattered about haphazardly on the steps and everything. But, okay, it's all fine. One story, though, I do want to tell is about a bank vault that survived a nuclear test detonation. You guys want to hear about this?
Yes. So, because I was wondering, I was like, is there any... Would a bank vault be a good place to go if we had 10 minutes? Should we drive to our local bank?
So here's the story. So on June 24th, 1957, there was a 37 kiloton nuclear test codenamed Priscilla, like a hurricane with a funny name. Priscilla was serving as an experiment about whether or not a bank vault built by the Mosler Safe Company would be able to survive the detonation of a nuclear explosion. So the bank president, Edwin Mosler, convinced the Federal Civil Defense Administration to let him build a bank vault near ground zero of this test. This bank vault was something that, Elliot would probably be able to, whip up with his tool shed. It was a 12 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet of reinforced concrete with 10-inch thick doors about a half mile from the blast.
Yeah, that'll fit nicely in my basement.
Yeah, how quickly can you pull those together?
I'm going to get working on it this afternoon.
So this experiment was called Response of Protective Vaults to Blast Loading. The bank was filled with stocks and bonds and cash and insurance policies.
All this stuff is going to be real valuable when currency in a post-currency world.
Well, because people were concerned about if there was a nuclear war, could there be the economy surviving? If you lose all of your records, oh yeah, my mortgage is now paid off and I don't have a student debt anymore.
You know what? I paid that. Put the last payment in last month, actually. Funny you ask.
How many human skulls do I have to pay for this insurance policy?
Yep. So here's what the Battle Creek Inquirer, it was a newspaper, said about the test after it was done. The test was to investigate the level of resistance of materials and structures to a nuclear blast at close range and was in response to the concern on the part of the banks and insurance companies over the protection of vital records and valuables. Very interestingly, in Hiroshima, after the atomic bombing, 4 of these Mosler vaults were actually found in the ruined basement of the Teikoku Bank. Their stuff was pretty much intact.
Really?
On the inside, yeah.
Was this Priscilla test, was it successful?
It was. You can see, I have a picture of it here in our show notes, and I'll link it in the show notes of our episode. The Priscilla test confirmed that the bank vault would be able to withstand, these test conditions. It doesn't answer the question of what happens when there's a thermonuclear detonation as opposed to, a 37 kiloton test. But more importantly is what Gabe was kind of joking and hinting at earlier is what happens to a national economy when there's paperwork is there, but, no people. Does a people actually make up an economy in terms of what it is, and what's the purpose of having all of these documents when the people themselves have died? One fun thing is former podcast guest Clark and I visited the National Atomic Test Site last year, which is outside of Las Vegas in Nevada, and we actually got to drive past this bank vault in person. We talk about it on episode 25 of our podcast here. It was, it's really interesting. They talked about it like, oh yeah, they built this bank vault so that they could show that everything would be fine. And the people who were given the tour were like, yeah, this is clearly proof that if you try hard, you can survive these things.
Right.
But if you look at the vault itself, it's
a shambles.
It's looking pretty bad right now.
So
it's pretty rusted out these days.
The money and the banks and the gold and everything would survive. If you were a person down there, is that good protection? I mean, does it protect you from radiation, for example? You would physically survive, but would the radiation get you in there?
As long as you had air, it is essentially, you can have a fallout shelter bunker does not have to be underground. The reason why it's really helpful underground is because you can survive the blast, the shock wave. That's a thing that concerns you. Gamma radiation can't go through everything.
Okay.
If you have enough concrete and then dirt or maybe even just air, like if you are in the center of a large building, and all that's between you and the outside where there's fallout accumulating is like a good amount of air, that's okay, because gamma radiation doesn't go on forever. It eventually kind of breaks apart and becomes less concerning for you. The more things you can put between you, it's better. Like concrete and lead. Lead is the best, X amount of lead thickness is good.
Yeah.
Concrete is also pretty good. You can need a little bit more of it. Dirt is also really good. Sandbags and things are quite good. So you want to do is you want to layer all those things together for your fallout shelter. And you can have an above ground fallout shelter if you're far enough away from the blast radius. Then if all you're concerned about is radiation, you could be okay.
Very good. Well, I'll be spending a lot more time at my local bank to make some friends.
Well, yeah, it's kind of interesting because the physics, I guess, we're just talking about a wavelength of wave, right? And so I'm in the residential energy efficiency field. And when you're talking about this, I'm like, oh, that's just like insulation in a wall.
Yeah.
This is just one more reason to insulate your walls, Although with something heavy, but it is the same thing. It's like if you put enough concrete on a wall, you'll get insulation out of it. If you put enough, and same thing with sound, right? Sound's just another wavelength. And so it's like if you get enough mass there, and it's just stuff that wave has to travel through.
So that's that episode. Let's go to the next one here, which is No Time Like the Past. Season 4, Episode 10, originally shown, as we mentioned earlier, on March 7th, 1963. This one is much less well known than Time Enough at Last. But Elliot, why don't you get to start us off here by reading the opening narration, which describes, pretty well what the opening premise of this is.
Exit 1, Paul Driscoll, a creature of the 20th century. He puts to a test a complicated theorem of space-time continuum, but he goes a step further, or tries to. Shortly, he will seek out 3 moments of the past in a desperate attempt to alter the present, one of the odd and fanciful functions in a shadowland known as the Twilight Zone.
Gabe, what is this about?
Yeah, so there's this guy, Paul Driscoll. He seems to be some sort of very brilliant scientist who builds a time machine. And
also well-dressed.
Of course. He's got a suit on. I think it's like, it might even be a 3-piece. He's got lots of layers under there.
Is it a double-breasted 3-piece?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
With waistcoat. And the scene is a very dramatic workspace that he's in on top of this big column, and he has his assistant there who's kind of like saying, "You're mad. Why are you exposing yourself to this risk?" And, he goes out on this long monologue saying, basically, we're all at risk now. This is, 1960, whatever. There's a possibility of nuclear war. There's something in the milk. I forget what he said.
Strontium-90.
Strontium-90 in the milk and all that. And he says, well, you're accepting danger here as well. I'm going to go try to fix this.
Did you happen to drink milk this morning, Harvey? What was the strontium-90 content of the glass? And has it occurred to you that the things you've been eating over the last couple of years might be turning your bones into sawdust? Oh, Harvey, speak to me of jeopardy, if you will, but don't make it sound as if I have an exclusive franchise on the calculated risk. You and I both share this dubious distinction with several million of our peers who inhabit the 20th century. I will now tell you as succinctly as possible how I classify the times. We live in a cesspool, a septic tank, and the keeper of the sewer? Man. He is a scientifically advanced monkey who walks upright and with eyes wide open into an abyss of his own making. His bombs, his fallout, his poisons, his radioactivity, everything he designs as an art for dying is his excuse for living. No, Harvey, we live in an exquisite bedlam, an insanity, maybe all the more grotesque by the fact that we don't recognize it as insanity.
The plan is to go back to certain key events in time, recent history, to change the timeline and take the world off of this perilous course that leads to, global conflict and nuclear weapons, and he's going to use his time machine to do that.
Did it seem like to you, based on watching the episode, he's in a world that's like an alternate history of our world in 1963, where there have been atomic wars that are maybe an exchange of 2 countries, not just dropping them on Japan, and that there's actually a fully poisoned world? Or is it just his take on our actual timeline that it's certainly a dangerous world, there's radiation in the air, water, and food due to atomic testing and things? Which of those did you guys thought that was? Elliot, what do you think?
I took it to be that he's just very disillusioned with 1963, basically living in the world. He's kind of standing in for all of us as at least like American society. The Cuban Missile Crisis had happened in 1962, so I do think that was this thing that made these fears much more visceral. Previously it was, okay, the bombs have been tested and stuff, but this is like, whoa, we were actually within a hair's breadth of it. So I think to me, that scans that it's like realistic that I think he's on the far end of the spectrum of that. Mm-hmm. The reason that I think we're not actually at nuclear war at that point is the reticence of his assistant, who is kind of saying, it's not that bad, like this isn't a good course of action. I feel like if we were actually in nuclear war, it would be more like all hands on deck. Sure, let's go back and try to change the past. Like, it can't hurt, right? It's worth a shot.
I thought his assistant was the one who was just like disillusioned. What are you going to do about it? Trying to make your own like life. But when I first watched this, I thought it was way more in the future. I thought, for them maybe like 2020 as opposed to 1963, and that there had been nuclear wars and things are bad and the world is slowly dying. And
that's a very interesting read. I had not thought about that at all. No.
Well, I think
that's plausible though. I could see that.
Anyways, whatever the scenario is, he decides, Paul Driscoll, to, maybe he didn't think about this all that well thought out, but he's
a very smart guy because he obviously invented a time machine.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, but I feel that he lost the thread on some of the details of the plot after that point.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay.
He's good with the tactics, not so much with the strategy, right?
Yeah.
So he goes to 3 points in history, as Gabe mentioned. He goes first to Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945, which was the day of the atomic bombing. He tries to warn a police captain about the incoming bomber attack by the United States. Doesn't work. Paul gets sent back to his timeline. The police captain, who fortunately speaks English, just thinks he's a crazy person. Why would he believe anything that he's talking about?
Yeah, but he kind of is a crazy person because he gives this warning like 10 minutes before the bomb goes off, and it would be lunatic, and they need some time to figure out if it's credible. So why is he going there 10 minutes before, and they're going to evacuate the whole city in 10 minutes?
I was hard on the episode the same way in the notes here. I think the idea is that he got to somewhere else and then got arrested.
Okay.
Because he's a random American hanging out in a war torn Japan, and he held him in a jail for a while before he was able to talk to the captain.
He should have brought a movie, or a picture of the bomb and been like, look, I'm this is what's going to happen. That would have been more compelling than just some crazy American dude who shows up.
His suit was modern.
Right, yeah.
Right? You don't have
it's very important.
You don't have double-breasted suits like that in 1945.
I mean, I do think it could be that he's kind of operating with a level of naivete of human nature and stuff, because I do think it kind of goes along with his disillusionment and his sort of pacifism philosophy as well that he expresses throughout and whatever. And I just think when you put the stuff together, it's the flip side of the disillusion he feels is maybe an idealism about human nature that if I could only go back and explain it to people, then they would listen.
If I could only tell this police captain who may or may not have the authority to evacuate a city and may or may not have the capability to do it in 10 minutes.
Right.
And I also don't understand too what that would solve.
Say
it works.
Yeah.
And the bomb is dropped. How does that stop future atomic wars or anything? If anything, does that not cause the United States to be like, shoot, they got us.
Yeah.
Well, now we'll drop 3.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nagasaki was not Hiroshima was a target, but Nagasaki was the backup target. There was another city that originally was planned, but the weather prevented them from being able to go to that target, so they went somewhere else. Originally, Kyoto was one of the cities that was meant to be a target, but the guy who was involved in planning, I think it was Henry Stimson, the Secretary of Defense, at one point had said him and his wife visited Kyoto and it was beautiful, and they're like, we're not going to put this on the target list. So I don't know really what the logic behind this is.
I also think it was a very myopic kind of American perspective to say, I'm going to go and put the onus on the Japanese to evacuate.
Good point.
That's why didn't we go to FDR and say hey, don't call for the bombs,
Right.
or go back to Oppenheimer and say hey, don't do the Manhattan Project.
There is a debate in historian circles about whether or not the United States actually did warn Japan, in particular Hiroshima, in advance about the atomic bomb. There's these things called LeMay leaflets, which are named after Curtis LeMay. Curtis Bombs Away LeMay, who was head of strategic bombing in the Pacific Theater in World War II. These were dropped on cities on August 1st in Japan. And what they warned was, quote, read this carefully as it may save your life or the life of a relative or friend. In the next few days, 4 or more of the cities named on the reverse side of this leaflet will be destroyed by American bombs. We are determined to destroy all of the tools of the military clique that they are using to prolong this useless war. In accordance with America's well-known humanitarian policies, the American Air Force, which does not wish to injure innocent people, now gives you the warning to evacuate the cities named and save your lives. Now, it sounds pretty bad, but of course, these were not talking about atomic weapons. They were talking about firebombing, which had done an incredible amount of damage in Tokyo and other cities. And we're not 100% sure, based on the things that I've been reading, that they actually were given to Hiroshima in advance.
Well, it's also kind of like when you're like, I'm just going to keep punching my fist and walk towards you, and if you don't move, it's your fault.
Yeah.
It's like this isn't really exculpatory at all or fair. I mean, I think it's the same thing in the episode. Why would the Japanese captain listen to him? He thinks he's a spy. I think that's the obvious conclusion you would come to. If you receive one of these leaflets, I think you'd be like, this is a piece of disinfo propaganda that's just trying to abandon the city.
And just the people that, I'm listening to Hardcore History, Dan Carlin's doing a series on the Japanese. It just seemed like the whole country was just very focused on supporting the state. And they would see that and nobody's going to move. But I never understood. I think we may have talked about it. Why not just drop the bomb next to the city so they can see what America has and say, okay, if you don't surrender, we're going to start dropping this stuff. That's much more credible, I think, than some leaflets.
Well, you can listen to the next episode of this podcast, which will be released in February. We covered the movie Fat Man and Little Boy, which was a movie with a stellar cast of people like Laura Dern, Paul Newman, John Cusack, and it was garbage. But the movie, it covers the debates of the scientists in the Manhattan Project who called for exactly that, a test demonstration, bring Japan, their officials over to the United States. They'll watch this test detonation happen, and then you'll say the next one is on your head, surrender. And this was completely debated, and this is the debate that people, if they have any exposure in high school to nuclear weapons, it's often this debate about, should we have used the bomb? How should we have used it? Was it really to cause Japan to surrender, who was already offering to surrender, but just not unconditionally? They wanted to keep their emperor. Or was it to show the world that the United States is now a player on the world stage? Is it to scare the Russians into not invading U.S. interests around the world? That's certainly the debate that was there, but there was a petition by a scientist who was heavily involved, who invented and conceived of the idea of nuclear fission, a supercritical chain reaction. Leo Szilard, he had a petition among scientists exactly calling for that particular point. After Hiroshima, the bombing of Hiroshima, the Army, funny enough to the story, they did actually order, the Army did, not scientists or anyone else involved in the project. The Army itself ordered atomic bomb warning leaflets to be written up and produced, but it took too long. By the time they had all these things printed, they didn't actually coordinate when the bomb was going to be dropped on the second city, which was not too far after. They had these leaflets and they dropped them, but they dropped them the day after the bomb happened. So as people were surviving, trying to survive the after effects of the Nagasaki bombing, these leaflets came down and said, "Hey, watch out!" Essentially, and this is according to historian Alex Wellerstein. It's pretty wild. So what does Paul do next, Gabe? Because he's failed at stopping the atomic bombings in Japan. So what's next?
Somehow he's not killed in the bombing of.
He when he wants to, he kind of like fades away.
Yeah, there's like the smoke, and it's But so his next mission, his next attempt, I should say, is he goes to Berlin in August 1939. This is before World War II starts. He goes to a hotel room. It's overlooking this rally where Hitler is speaking, and he pulls out this rifle that he's gonna assassinate Hitler. But he kind of gets thwarted at one point. The housekeeper comes in and, for whatever reason, he lets her in.
Yeah.
And then
he forgot to put out the little "do not disturb."
Yeah, right. Yeah, he has a conversation with her where she's kind of saying, "Oh, how great is our Führer?" And he responds lukewarm, and she looks at him suspiciously. And then he goes to kill Hitler again and takes the shot, but it doesn't fire, so he loads another round in the chamber. And then the SS, the housekeeper, comes back with the SS troops to find him, and he loses his opportunity, which for me, once again, if you're gonna do this, why not just go back and kill baby Hitler or something like that, rather than this complicated plot? And also, why not just keep going back and trying to do this over and over as a one-shot time machine?
Like, for instance, had you not opened the door to the chambermaid and just took your shot that you had lined up, that probably would have, she would have waited, you know what I mean? She would have gone to the next room.
Yeah, exactly.
And is the thought here that you kill Hitler, it means that there's no Nazi Germany, no World War II, no justification to build the bomb in the first place, and therefore the United States just be like, well, we could, but what's the reason to?
The interesting thing is he does kind of have a broader pacifism than just the nuclear stuff, so I think you could also, I think part of it is that as well.
Makes sense.
That, he's talking about convention, he has a problem with conventional warfare at all as well, so it's not just about nukes, and so I think that could be part of
I don't want to
the thing.
That.
I mean, this is the obvious. If you're going to do one thing, you're going to kill Hitler, right? So that's probably all they're thinking here. But I agree. Especially why not go back to not at the rally? Go back to art school or something.
Yeah,
Hitler there,
right. Yeah, exactly. Be like, Hitler, you're actually a great artist. Go
exactly.
Go do paintings.
It's really nice art. Yeah.
Well, this idea that he has general pacifism really leads him to his third destination. Elliot, why don't you cover this one, his final stop?
Sure.
And this we're covering a lot. This is all really, it's funny. It's all Act 1. This whole thing we're talking about is within 10 minutes.
Yep. Which I think is part of what's so weird about this. It's you're like, oh, this is going to be an episode about killing baby Hitler. Yeah. And then we sort of do 3 plots very quickly in a 45-minute episode. So the third attempt is he's on board the Lusitania, which is the British ocean liner that we know was torpedoed on May 6, 1915 by a German U-boat, thereby basically leading to America's engagement in World War One, right?
Right. Not immediately, like a year later, but certainly.
But like when you read the history books,
yeah.
that's like how they explain it. That was sort of a critical turning point, right?
Right. And of course, he says, what does he say? He's like, hey, there's a German U-boat out there. Turn around or be on the lookout. And
yeah,
they're like, we got.
You only have to change it 1 degree. You only have to change it 1 degree, and it's again like, why would you expect this guy to listen to you? There's no reason. The captain does the right thing and has him sent to the brig or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You know. I thought again in terms of the American myopia, the fact that the focus is on like the Lusitania and not like saving Franz Ferdinand or something could have prevented the whole war, maybe, or maybe it was inevitable anyways. Right.
He definitely seems like one of those people that's he's got the magic powers, but he can't make choices for people. He needs to convince them to do their own. It's like he's Gandalf. He's like, I can't take the ring myself, but I need to have the people of this world make these decisions for themselves. I'm just gonna give you some information and maybe point you in the right direction. But that's about it.
Yeah. So it seems like he is maybe not as concerned about the war in general as long as America's not involved. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's also fascinating too that they focus on World War One because there's a new movie coming out this year, I think called 1917, that's about World War One. But really today, most people don't talk about World War One all that much. Oh, I guess the Wonder Woman movie took place in World War One, but again, that was like a novel, thing for people. But I think it was fascinating. I read this somewhere that when this episode came out, that time was closer to World War One than we are today to World War Two. Yeah. So it shows you if we were to make this today, it would be about Pearl Harbor. Yeah. But even then, that's pretty far.
That's incredible.
Pretty far away. So would this, if we were to remake this today, would it be about 9/11?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. But I mean, World War One kind of set the board game or set the chessboard for World War Two, basically. So
yeah.
Anyway.
So ultimately, Paul, he fails at all 3 of these attempts, and he believes that they're now operating under Terminator rules, which means that, like the Terminator movies, which we covered on this podcast with our friend Alex, time travel rules for Terminator is that, the history is what it is in the future. You can't really change your present by changing the past.
Yeah.
Whatever you do will ultimately still cause it to happen, just...
Because the present already accounts for the fact that you were going to go back and do that anyway.
It's not like Back to the Future rules, which is you can create a separate split timeline where Donald Trump becomes president, and that weird plan, right? Like that timeline would never happen. Like,
all right, so what's this dude's solution then?
Well, I think he decides to pack it up, right? He decides, all right, I can't think of any other plans like killing baby Hitler or sabotaging the Manhattan Project, pushing this guy we talked about earlier, Leo Szilard, who invented the idea of supercritical chain reactions by kind of in London standing at a crosswalk waiting for the time to cross. Instead of pushing him into the street, he decides just to go back to his like a hometown, right? A place that I don't know if it's a hometown, but it's like a small town, Homeville, Indiana, 1881. So he goes way back into the past. He goes to basically when life was good, right? When you're free of modern problems like atomic weapons and radiation.
For me, this was so interesting because there seems to be this among some people today, this nostalgia for the time that this guy was part of, like 1950s, 1960s. It was a simpler time and Americana, Main Street USA. And this was like a very similar vision that this guy had. It was just a little bit earlier. I mean, this quaint town with like bunting and the town square and children singing and preparing for July 4th, and he just feels so refreshed going back there.
Yeah, Elliot, are we going to be telling our kids like in 20 or 30 years we're like, I remember that time in the 2000s when
I think we're already doing it, like the new season of Stranger Things that takes place in the mall. And there's the new Wonder Woman 1984 and stuff. I think for us it's the 80s, and it's the mall is the town square.
Yeah,
for sure.
We forget the obvious point that this dude's a white guy going back to 1881. Like that's
everything's great.
It's only nostalgic because he happens to be a white guy.
Exactly.
For sure.
We need to make that point right away here. But
does this episode give you some vibes of Star Trek? I know we covered on previously.
I was thinking City on the Edge of Forever when I was seeing this. I'm like, yeah, this is totally that. And just to recap quickly, that we covered it on the podcast. So that's an episode where the crew of the Enterprise goes back in time and has to face this big dilemma of whether they meddle in the timeline or not. They choose not to meddle.
And that one is if they meddle by saving a woman from being pushed in the street, she becomes a pacifist leader, keeps the United States out of World War II. The Germans win. They build an atomic bomb. The world sucks.
Yeah.
No Starfleet.
So they have to let her die. But But this guy, I mean, he's he similarly to City on the Edge of Forever, he falls in love with a woman. They're at some dinner where he starts talking his pacifist rhetoric in the face of this guy who's really like this war hawk. And
it's a great scene. It's the best scene I think of the episode.
No,
absolutely,
it's quite good. And
so because the dinner guy who's like the bank president or something, interestingly, isn't he?
Yeah. Another evil bank president,
right? But doesn't have the look of a man who's been to war, right? Yeah. Who maybe somehow he got out of fighting in the Civil War, perhaps.
Rod Stilley must have been denied a bank loan at one point.
Yeah, and so he is sort of he's sort of a war hawk, and he's saying, we should plant our flag everywhere. We should take the land away from the Indians, whatever.
He uses another word for Indians that we're not going to say here. No, but this woman, this woman falls in love with him because of his pacifist views, and it's clear that he knows things because the assassination of James Garfield happens the night that he's talking to this woman, and he's like, oh, so it's happened already. And she's like, what's up with this dude? Like, he knows something. And you can tell he's very tortured by living in this world where he knows these bad things that are going to happen, but he's very resolved, at least up to a certain point, to say, I'm not going to get involved. I'm not going to save James Garfield. I'm going to just live my life, try not to interfere. And actually, his friend gives him this warning before he goes and says, beware, anything you do can change the timeline.
Like a butterfly effect type thing. And we don't have to get into, there's a few other little things in this episode, but the real quick thing that happens at the end, the twist is that Paul, like he said, vows not to change the past, but he realizes all of a sudden that, oh, shoot, that woman that I now am in love with, she's a school teacher. Today, 13 kids burn in a fire at that school. Oh, I think I know how to stop this. So he does something to try to stop it, but it directly causes what ends up killing all of those kids.
Yeah, I think he reads in a book that the school is burned down because a carriage goes out of control and the kerosene lamp from the carriage flies off. And by trying to stop the carriage from doing that, he causes a commotion and the horses run off and end up burning the school.
And he had been warned before he went back to Homeville. He discovered that he couldn't change anything in the first 3 times, and then he'd been warned, go back and do not try to change anything because any slight change you make may affect the future.
Yeah,
which I felt like. So now we switch from Terminator rules to the Back to the Future rules.
Yeah,
exactly. And so that's what became, I think, very confusing. It's like, what is the lesson here? If the lesson has to do with time travel and the right way to do time travel, you've introduced 2 different sets of rules. Because if you can't change the future anyways, then it's like, just do whatever you want to do.
One of those kids that was killed was a German, Austrian exchange student who eventually now invents the bomb earlier and gives Hitler a super atomic weapon that drops from blimps.
What was interesting for me about this, though, just quick aside, is because he was so resolute, he's not going to change anything. And for him, it's never really explained in the episode. I mean, it's implied that it's because it's a woman that he has fallen for. But he makes this decision. He's like, oh, screw it. I'm actually gonna start getting involved now. To me, I mean,
23 school children burning in a fire. That's pretty visceral,
Yeah, and I think Elliot's got some great stuff on this in a second. So let's get into that. Gabe, why don't you read us our closing narration, the lesson learned according to Rod Sterling for Paul.
Incident on a July afternoon, 1881. A man named Driscoll, who came and went, and in the process learned a simple lesson, perhaps best said by a poet named Lathbury, who wrote, "Children of yesterday, heirs of tomorrow, what are you weaving? Labor and sorrow? Look to your looms again. Faster and faster fly the great shuttles prepared by the master. Life's in the loom, room for it, room. Tonight's tale of clocks and calendars in the Twilight Zone."
Is room a verb in that sentence?
I think I looked up because I was wondering if there's more to this poem, and I looked it up, and I think it's actually there's life in the loom. Make room for it.
Make room for it.
Should I?
I'm not sure if that was.
This is what it is original, according to the Wikipedia entry for.
Yeah, it could have been an error or some intentional editing in the original episode. But in other words, I took this to mean. There's life in the loom, so make room for that life.
Okay.
Basically just get back to work, and your work can make things better. And you can have some hope, which is kind of required for a good life, right?
Interesting. Well, Elliot, This episode of the Twilight Zone, it's a little unfocused in the sense and uneven because the first act is really quick. That's where he goes back in time, try to solve all those things. That's where the Hiroshima scene takes place. The second act is when he goes back to the time in Indiana in 1881, and it's kind of really relaxed. And then Act 3 is the quick, like, oh shoot, I need to save those kids. You make some sense for us of what this episode is trying to tell us.
What we're trying to do, yeah. So I think I had the same reaction that we all did of, like, if you look at this literally as a time travel narrative, it's kind of a mess, and it doesn't really, we talked about it switches time travel rules and stuff, and so it's like I'm not really sure what lesson to draw from it in that sense, right? I think the other thing about this is, apparently in season 4 of the Twilight Zone they all went to an hour, which is, I don't know if there were any there. I think there might have been some other hour ones as specials, along the way, but most of them were a half an hour, and so it definitely got the sense that it was kind of longer and a little aimless and meandering, and I think maybe part of that was like they were trying to fill time, or it was just more ambitious. Maybe it was more ambitious, than kind of Rod Serling was used to doing, because I think most of the Twilight Zones are pretty straightforward and simple ideas, right? That were
Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, you're done.
And they're all happening in 22 minutes. Exactly. Okay, so I think this episode makes more sense if you take the time travel just as a plot device. Right, so in the first episode we watched, the atomic bomb was really the plot device. It was the sci-fi plot device, but it wasn't really what the episode was about. The episode was about this guy's desire to read and careful what you wish for and whatever. Yep. I think in this episode, the time travel is the plot device, and what it's really about are fears of living in the nuclear age.
Oh, you're speaking my language. Keep preaching.
So let's break this down, okay? I'm going to try to convince you of this. So, it's actually a parable about kind of us as society living in the nuclear age. So, to set the stage, this was released in 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis had happened 1 year before that, and that was really like a shocking event to the national psyche, where nuclear annihilation was now possible or maybe even inevitable, as opposed to just this intellectual thing that we know they're out there, we know they've been used, and it was a human tragedy, but now it really feels like, oh my God, we almost went extinct, right? So that's in the back of the audience minds, and at the beginning of the episode, Driscoll expresses a general disillusionment with the 20th century, but all the specifics he actually talks about are very tied to the nuclear weapons specifically.
Yes, strontium-90 in the milk.
Quote, bombs, fallout, poisons, radioactivity. And then he kind of ends that monologue with,
ultimately somebody pushes a button, and just as ultimately this Earth disappears. A few germs will rise up out of the rubble and wave microscopic flags of victory and shed a few microscopic tears for the race of men.
So I don't know if he realizes it, but that's really what's driving him to this point of disillusion. Mm-hmm. The other motivator is his pacifist philosophy, which seems sincerely concerned with the evils of all wars, including conventional wars, because he does mention, basically every American conflict between the Civil War and the Korean War at some point in the episode. So we're not just talking about nukes, and maybe the point is human history basically is this long list of wars that got us to this point, and now that nukes exist, the next war may be the last one, right?
What they say, the World War I and II were fought with bombs and planes. World War III will be nukes. World War IV will be sticks and stones.
Right, exactly. So I think the question that the episode is trying to answer is, what is the right way to deal with the fear that we all feel living in a time when nuclear bombs threaten our very existence? So, okay, what do you guys think? Are you with me so far?
With you.
Yep.
I'm tracking.
Okay, cool. So, and that's such a strong way to start this episode. That's what I think is disappointing in the narrative of that it kind of falls apart. But we're kind of all there in the beginning of the episode. So what I really think is it's going through 3 stages of dealing with the fear. Okay, it's kind of like the 7 stages of grief. Okay, but it's abbreviated.
I gotta get you a whiteboard. All right, here we go.
Okay, so stage number 1 is magical thinking, and so I think his 3 attempts at changing World War I and II, it's basically him just trying to like wish it away, right? It's almost like, I wish there was a genie where I could get 3 wishes. Mm-hmm. By the way, there's smoke and stuff when he goes back in time, and he gets his 3 wishes, and I think the way that the things fail is dumb, but the point that the episode is trying to tell us is basically what we already know, which is magic isn't real. There are no genies. There is no, magical solution.
It's less like a genie, and it's more like those pop-up ads that are like, one weird trick to lose 100 weight,
right.
100 pounds. It's have this Asahi I forget what the thing is called, but it's like the berry that no one knows what it is, and it will solve everything. You just click this button.
Goji berry or whatever.
Yeah. You click that one thing and you'll be fine. That's kind of what he is thinking.
Exactly. Ultimately, for one reason or another, that's not true. And we kind of know that, right? That's a natural first place to go, though, is...
Sure.
Even though we know it's not true. Gosh, wouldn't it be nice?
It's an Act 1 type of thinking.
The next place he goes in his mind is he realizes there's no quick fix, and he basically falls back to our human prime directive of self-preservation. And with this plan to travel back to 1881, and he knows that even though this is going to require living as a passive resident and not being able to be an active participant in history, but basically just can I at least individually escape this, right? And so traveling back to 1881 obviously puts him out of physical danger, but I think the fact that he picks a place that's got that this imagined pastoral place with a lawn and summer concerts and stuff, it's not just about the physical danger. I think it's, if anything, even more so about psychological safety and seeking that, right? Which asterisks if you're a white man,
right.
It's not necessarily a place that's going to offer psychological safety to other people, but it will to him. That's what he imagines, and that's really like just society wise. Yeah, there's the possibility that we're all going to be burned up in the future, but the current thing we're actually suffering from, our current scars, are actually the fear that we're living in, right? The psychological damage that's trauma that's creating.
It's one of the most unique things about the nuclear age is that it took a long time for Americans to enter World War I or II because it was over there. They can't reach us. We have oceans to protect us. From simply an American perspective, nuclear bombs and bombers and ICBMs, they cause even small countries like North Korea to be able to threaten the very psyche of the United States. And now we're like, shoot, this little country over here that can barely feed itself, now they can destroy American cities? That adds an extra level of fear than you normally would never have unless you're watching that terrible Red Dawn remake where North Korea invades the United States.
Right. So this stage 2, another way, like the word I was thinking of for this was escapism, is essentially what he's trying to do. And it kind of reminded me of, the survivalist movement that took off in this time period where people were building bunkers out in the woods. And it was essentially like, I'm going to check out of society and you all might not survive, but I'm at least going to, be able to ride this out.
No, it's interesting because you do see in the episode just how that sense of relief when he goes back to this time, he looks so, he's like, oh, I'm far from that. I mean, obviously it changes. He realizes he's not, but yeah, you definitely get that sense that he's just so happy. He feels like this huge weight is
huge
lifted.
Sense of relief.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of, it's such a quick turn in the episode from like, I'm going to go back and save the world to, screw it, I'm out of here. See y'all. Bye. See you, suckers. But if we're being honest, that's a pretty human emotion, right? That's a pretty human reaction. And like, how can we really be sure until we're in that moment? Who among us will actually be down there in the rubble pulling it out? And who among us will be out in our, in the woods trying to get, save ourselves?
If Henry Bemis had a time machine, he would 100% go in the future, get a Kindle, Paperwhite, and then go way back in time and read books before humans even evolved into being able to stand up.
Right, exactly.
Like, he'd be like, I'd rather concern myself with, like, dinosaurs interrupting my book.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. As long as Henry Bemis had his glasses, he never left stage 2 escapism. He was very happy just living in that forever.
He never would have left the Big Vault.
Our man Driscoll does not have that reaction. Ultimately, he works through something, and we won't go into the specifics of it again. But I think the point is, ultimately, he comes through that and realizes like that escapism isn't going to work for him. That's not a good solution either. That just makes him a passive, a viewer of history, and he needs to be active in it.
He's a pacifist, but not a passive actor, right?
Not a passive actor.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's stage 3?
So stage 3 is acceptance and hope. Basically, I think this is summed up in his kind of closing monologue thing, which is to leave the yesterdays alone and do something about the tomorrows. They're the ones that count, the tomorrows, right? So he's sort of saying, there's hope in if we can work to make the world a better place. There's hope in that, even though it's a scary situation we're in. And Rod Serling concludes with the poem you read, which my rephrasing of it is basically good things are possible if you put your head down and get back to work, right? So we need to accept the reality of today's world, the fact that it is a scary place, but also hope for improving it if we work at it, right? which is, I guess, a good place to thank all of our friends and maybe listeners who are working in nuclear non-proliferation and on these issues.
Yeah, well, there's definitely some of us that are building the bombs and trying to make the world safer by increasing deterrence and all of that stuff. But I think even them, their heart may be in the right place. Gabe, what do you think of what Elliot put together here and laid it out?
No, I think it's a really interesting interpretation, and just, you know, the different reactions. It did help to make sense of this kind of narrative for me. I think, you know, when I watched it, I got the sense of we're always doing things that can change other people's lives in ways that we don't know. The difference for him is when he goes to the past, he knows how he's doing it. But for us today, we don't have visibility in terms of how the actions we do can or cannot, you know, change something. And so I think for me, the message fits very well into that kind of third piece of, you know, let's do the best we can today, you know, rather than going back and trying to change it. But, you know, think ahead and think about, you know, the actions that we have today and how they affect the future.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's great with the way you outlined it, because it really sums up well the way people think about these topics. Is that it's so easy when you're faced with dangers of whether it's the nuclear age and global destruction, or even it's just like a really hard part of your life. You're going through a stressful moment. Maybe you lost a family member, or someone's sick or something. It's so easy to get like really overwhelmed by that, and you become a passive observer, and you want to just escape and go back to a time where it was easier for you, whether that was easy for you at the time or not. It's one of the things that's so important about people who try to move the needle on nuclear danger towards the other direction of safety is to find ways to harness that fear and anxiety, and don't just stoke it. People can stoke it, and then you can have other reactions. You can have really bad reactions.
Yeah.
Look at all this danger. We need to build up our own kind of bombs and more, and build the Russians have atomic bombs. We need the super. Oh, they've got bombers. Now we need missiles. Oh, they've got missiles. Let's drop them from space. You know, it's like that is a reaction. But some people who in our field try to push people towards another way. Harness that energy. Build grassroots movements to convince your leadership. Run for election. You know, do all this stuff you need to do to really get rid of, you know, the atomic bomb. And I see that in a lot of people today, especially young people who are joining movements like the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. That just won a Nobel Peace Prize. And I think this is really fitting very well for what Paul Driscoll's final approach. Really powerful stuff. Just reminding me when I was reading your notes, I wanted to share a passage from Jonathan Schell, who's a philosopher who wrote really well on nuclear war and the dangers of it, and really inspired me to get into this field. His 1984 book, The Abolition, he writes what inspires people like Paul Driscoll and, you know, actual real life people too. We are not only fearful of the thought of suffering a nuclear holocaust, but repelled by the thought of perpetrating one. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Premier Khrushchev remarked that the smell of burning flesh was in the air. But, in truth, that smell is never far from our nostrils now. The world's nuclear arsenals threaten to annihilate everyone in response to a transgression or mistake by any one party. That is how the doctrine of deterrence is designed. In consenting to live under it, we bear responsibility not only for the lives of the people whom we would kill, but also for the lives of those whom they would kill, namely our families, our friends, and our fellow citizens. Through the balance of terror, we come to hold a dagger to the hearts of those nearest and dearest to us, as well as to threaten those far away. The parent threatens the child, the lover, the friend, the citizen, the citizen. Our acceptance of nuclear weapons is in that sense a default of parenthood, of love, of friendship, of citizenship, in which we all, like hijackers of an airplane, take one another hostage and threaten to kill one another. In acquiescence to the balance of terror, we become irresponsible parents, cold-hearted lovers, faithless friends, and apathetic citizens. And in making a conscious choice to lift the nuclear peril, we resolve to escape this pervasive corruption of our lives. We resolve to clear the air of burning flesh. I love that passage. I think it's very well written, and it really describes the feeling of why Paul Driscoll couldn't just stay stuck in escapism. He wanted to make that conscious choice, and his decision is, I'll go back to my own time period, and I'll make the future from that point on better by my own actions.
I guess the question for you guys is, I mean, we're talking about, you know, some lofty ideas here, and maybe the feeling is for those who are in power, it's easy for them to make these kind of changes or choices. What do you guys think we as,
yeah.
just
The common man.
the common person, I mean, what are things that we can do to advance that and to maybe make the world better?
Well, I mean, there used to be that people were actively involved in pressuring governments to make changes with the nuclear arsenal, because there's people who are in leadership positions also feel like they are trapped in a position where, yeah, they'd love to get rid of nuclear bombs. Ronald Reagan famously was, wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons because he was terrified of them. He was as scared as Paul Driscoll was in Act 1, but he felt the only way to deal with it was, you could try to do your best, and if you can find a way to get rid of them and not worry about the other side also having them, then maybe we can do something about it. But until then, we need weapons to deter them. So the default of deterrence, people can't really seem to get out of it. But people also, I would argue for that, a lot of that, it's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of being able to, start to want to move towards a world where we're not just hanging by luck every time we deal with this. I think that's something that if people start to see that again and maybe start to realize that, yeah, the Cold War is over, but the danger of nuclear weapons is still there, figuring out how to harness that, it's running for office. It's trying to convince people. It's trying to make the people aware that this is an important issue, and it's not just something that is found in old Cold War movies that this weird podcast talks about. It's a reality that's there today. And talking to your leaders and convincing them about it is a good way to do it. And you see some progress every once in a while. And for those of us who are, trying to convince kids to be good people in the world, it's to talk to them about it too, so that they don't just get scared and afraid of the dangers of these things. You talk about how you can, as citizens, influence your government, which is, I still feel like in America that's still a thing. We're just not particularly very good at it.
Mm-hmm. And it's about attention, I think. I think when you watch the Democratic debates that are happening right now in 2020, when you listen to this in 30 years, this is the time that we're in today. You don't hear a lot of questions about nuclear weapons anymore. It's not on the forefront of the mind, so I think.
There was one early on because Elizabeth Warren had put out there a no first use bill, but not anything since then. They're like, oh, we covered that question. It's not a problem there anymore. Right. Which is super weird.
I think one of these characters gets a redemption and one of them doesn't, because Driscoll ultimately kind of does come back to the present and is going to go kind of back out into society and grapple with it,
It does seem like Henry's going to crawl his way to that gun.
Yeah, and I think the episode's basically like, and he got what he deserved, basically, right? Because he was so stuck in the past at the expense of any, human relationships.
Well, Gabe, how about connect it to the city at the edge of forever? The way that ends is pretty sad. Spoiler alert for people that haven't seen that episode of the TV show or listened to our episode of the podcast. Shatner just lets the woman die. What do you think the lesson that came out of that? It seemed like Shatner, and was that episode ever referenced again in the future? Was it just tend to be a one-off thing? Well, how did that resolve versus how you thought maybe these episodes resolved of people trying to...
Yeah, I mean, I think there it was a very, utilitarian calculus that we need to let this one person die to, save many others, that needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one type thing. But I still think there's that causal aspect of that and an intention about taking action that will impact the future. So I think that I tie it together with intentionality, careful thought about what you do today and how that impacts the future versus just making decisions in the moment, acting based on human passion. I mean, a lot of Star Trek was about moderating human passion with logic and the counterpoint there. And I think the message, at least I get from this, is, we have this anger and this hatred that is sometimes within us that leads us to, declare war and hate our enemies and things like that. I do think the episode is calling for moving beyond that to a more enlightened state. So I actually view it in a very similar vein of Star Trek, and I think it's a nice counterpoint to that first episode, which for me is a lot about just the fragility and what can happen if we don't act intentionally.
let's do our rating system here. I like to use a consistent scale of 1 to 5 so that it's consistent across all of our episodes. We can kind of compare which are the good ones and which are the bad apples that we had to talk about. Maybe like, Atomic Train is pretty low on our list here. But I also like to tailor the rating system because I get super critical about everything. So I have crunched the numbers here, and let's do a scale of 1 to 5 pairs of glasses. Eyeglasses. Because one pair can easily be broken and you're a reader out of luck in the apocalypse. But if you got 5 pairs, hey, you can even afford to read books while riding around the rubble in your e-scooter. I'm going to give 5 glasses to Time Enough at Last. I think it's one of the perfect episodes of Twilight Zone. And, originally I was going to give 2.5 to this episode, but I think Elliot convinced me.
Nice. I
don't think that's what they were really trying to do, but I think overall I'm going to have a newfound appreciation for it. I'm bumping it up to 3. I can even maybe go 3.5, but I don't think it's there just yet. So 5 for Time Enough at Last, 3 pairs of glasses for No Time Like the Past.
I'll do 4 for Time Enough at Last. A very strong episode, but for me there's some weird stuff in there. The wife character. It's
yeah.
But anyway, and I also would go 3 for No Time Like the Past.
I'm going to go based on what I think the purpose of the Twilight Zone is, which is not necessarily to be a great drama, but I think it's meant to be these idea pieces that get you talking and thinking. So on that scale, I'm going to give a 3 to Time Enough at Last, which is dramatically better done, but I think less interesting to talk about. And I'm going to give a 4.5 to No Time Like the Past.
I love it. Different perspectives on it, and this is great. You need a good podcast episode, needs good things to talk about, or else we're just going to talk about atomic trains for 2 hours, and it's not very entertaining. So if people want to listen to more things similar or want to experience something like this particular episode of The Twilight Zone, I've got 3 recommendations for people to check out. One is the Twilight Zone episode I mentioned earlier, The Shelter. That's a great one. If you listen to it, you can then have a podcast episode here to follow on. But I also recommend an episode called Walking Distance, which is, I think, the better version of this No Time Like the Past. It's a man who is not a terrible person. He's a business guy. He's quick, and he's in town near his own hometown on a business trip, but he's getting his car worked on, and he goes, hey, I'm going to take a walk. And he takes a walk, and he ends up going to his town where he was as a kid. And he starts to reflect all of a sudden, like, wow, this is weird that I'm here, but this is nice. And he starts to get that nostalgia. And then part of the story is about how, well, maybe you are too attached to nostalgia and it wasn't really the way you looked at it, and you're corrupting your memory of this. And all this whole thing is really strong in terms of Rod Sterling's past. Like, his relationship with his father was difficult. He spent time in war. He had friends die, and he wanted himself to go back to that time period. But he was concerned, it's going to be comforting. It's going to be a nice escape, but it's not going to be the solution. I need to do something else moving forward. So I would recommend that episode called Walking Distance. It's pretty good. I also recommend the TV show. It's a comedy called Last Man on Earth, starring Will Forte, where there's some sort of virus that knocks out pretty much everybody in the population, and he ends up being like Henry Bemis. But if you imagine Henry Bemis to be kind of like a schlump loser who is a little bit crazy, instead of collecting books, he collects famous paintings. At one point, he drives around on the ground with a B-2 nuclear bomber, just because why not? If you're the only one left in the world. It's a great comedy, and it's a fun take on what it's like if you're one of the last few people. If you have time enough at last, what would you do if you were also kind of like a little bit of a weirdo? And finally, similar to Twilight Zone episodes, I really like Black Mirror quite a lot. And one of my favorite episodes of Black Mirror, the kind of British version of, it's not the British Twilight Zone, but it is similar in terms of it's an anthology series with sci-fi elements, but mostly about technology. My favorite episode of that show is called San Junipero, and it is about people who, they have plenty of time at last, because when you die or you're an elderly person who's nearing death, you can download your brain and put it into a computer server and just live life in any time period you want for forever. Your body can be dead, but your consciousness can survive. And what meaning can you drive from that? And how can you potentially build connection with other people? I've watched that episode a couple of times now. Every time I bawl like a baby at the very end of it. So if you like these kinds of stories, I think that episode in particular of Black Mirror would be really good. Gabe, do you have anything you want to recommend to people?
Well, we talked about it a bunch here, so everyone should go watch City on the Edge of Forever and also listen to our podcast episode that touched upon that, as well as I think one other Star Trek episode. And as long as we're on Star Trek, another episode called Patterns of Force, which is a similar, they don't go back in time, but there's a similar message of stopping the rise of fascism and Nazis and things like that, but in a little bit of a different context. So if you like this idea of altering the course of a history on the path toward fascism and atrocity, then yeah. Finally, I'm very much enjoying Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He's doing a series on the Japanese involvement during World War II, Supernova in the East. That was very good treatment, and kind of talked about some of the stuff that we touched upon on the second episode here. I think he also did one on nuclear weapons, obviously.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, where he talks about the bombing of Hiroshima. In Supernova in the East, I don't think he's gotten up to the bombings, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm sure he will get to them, but just an interesting, very interesting listening. Yeah.
At one point, it'll be like, for some reason, there's this in the rubble of the Hiroshima police department. There was a note about a man, Paul Driscoll, some American who visited the captain a few moments before the bomb went off, and no one knows what that meeting was about, and there was no records of the death of Paul.
But he had a really nice suit.
Yeah, so that's really all we have. Elliot, what would you recommend people to check out?
Okay, I would recommend, sort of in the theme of the first episode, I would recommend the movie Arctic with Mads Mikkelsen. So it's sort of, the plane goes down in the Arctic, and he's the only survivor on the plane, and it kind of goes out from there, right? So, kind of a last man on Earth kind of thing. But I thought it was, I liked it because it explores some of these themes that we've talked about in terms of what happens, not to give too much away, but if there's a conflict between saving yourself and saving others, and what do you do, and kind of what makes life worth living, right? Like if you're gonna forsake others. Number 2, I would say 12 Monkeys, which is kind of a classic time travel. Let's go back in time and try to save the future kind of thing. If you haven't seen it,
it's with Brad Pitt and
a young Brad
Bruce
Pitt
Willis?
and Bruce Willis, and some others, early in Brad Pitt's career. So it's pretty interesting to see just from that perspective. Really interesting film, kind of a good ending, and I'll just leave it there. And then the last one is, I would say, pretty much anything by H.G. Wells, just as being such an inspiration, I think, for just kind of the very concept of the Twilight Zone. Yeah. It was kind of like the original Twilight Zone stuff, and you're probably familiar with all of the general ideas of a lot of his stories, and they've made their way into things like the Twilight Zone and
Mm-hmm.
other sci-fi. But if you haven't actually read it or in a while, they're short and they're fun, and so get yourself an anthology and read some of those. And I think an appropriate one to start with would be The Time Machine.
That's a great choice. Elliot, thanks so much for coming back on the episode. Was this better than Atomic Train?
I would say much better, yes.
Good.
I enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks, great, terrific. Gabe, welcome back as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes or want to tell us what we got wrong, either nuke-wise or when Gabe suggested that we should all be going around killing baby Hitler, there are a couple ways you can contact the show and let us know. Twitter, @NuclearPodcast. We're on Facebook. We're also on email, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com, and our website, supercriticalpodcast.com. I recently put up my 200, 300 plus list of nuke movies and TV shows that I've collected, some that we have done, and also ones that we can potentially do in the future. So go on that website, check it out, because there's lots of content there, as well as links to the resources that I used and we all used to prepare for today's episode. So if you want to read more, that's all there. So until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Gabe.
And Elliot.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we're bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.